Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. To get into some of this week's top business headlines with me today is Dr. Ola Brown, who is the founder of the Flying Doctors Healthcare Investment Company, which specializes in technology-enabled healthcare, focused public-private partnerships in Africa. She's also the author of the critically acclaimed book, Economic Banking and Finance in Emerging Markets. Thank you so much for joining me, Ola.
Thank you.
Good to have you on the program. I'd like us to start with the Twitter story. Elon Musk finally has his way. The CEOs are gone, and the company will ultimately be delisted, becoming a private company. What is the future of Twitter and social media based on this?
So I think it was one of those weird acquisition bids where nobody knew what was happening for quite a long period of time. And I think that at the time he made the offer, actually the price was fair, but then the tech sort of bust happened and actually the share price fell. Since Twitter shareholders have been, in limbo for a long time, it's nice to see finally the deal has closed. And honestly, in most people's tech portfolios, that's the only bright spot, as most of the shares have lost value. But what do I think is going to happen at Twitter going forward? I think, Twitter has been a loss-making company for a long time. And that's why some activist shareholders actually made a move for Jack Dorsey to be removed. So I think now we're going to see increased monetization. I think the very first thing that he did was try and reassure advertisers that the content moderation wouldn't drastically change. So you can already see where his focus is on making sure that the sources of revenue are steady. But I think we might see a few more subscription products. We'll definitely see a lot more maybe monetization in the e-commerce space as well. But one thing that we've grown to all know about Elon Musk is that he's very, very focused on revenue and the fundamentals.
Absolutely.
And I think that in terms of monetization, I think that there will be a very, 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 very sharp focus on that. In terms of content moderation, I think there are worries from Twitter users that there might be more extremist, because he's very freedom of speech, and that's the reason that he bought the company in the first place. So there's a lot of worries that there might be, extremist views expressed on Twitter. But I don't really think that's going to happen. I think that somebody that is so focused on revenue would not risk the revenue that advertisers bring by allowing too much extreme content.
Yeah, interesting. And, a lot of young people, businesses use Twitter as a way to reach markets, sell their goods and services. Is this going to increase Twitter's market share as the go-to online social media platform for business, for trading, for promotion of entrepreneurs, or is this going to constrict their market share?
Thinking about Elon again, like what I said, and him being so focused on revenue, I think he'll try and monetize that trade. I think he might even build an e-commerce payment platform onto the platform, thereby getting a share of all the sales that take place on Twitter.
Yeah, so interesting times for Twitter. Now let's move over to Nigeria. Big news this week with the announcement that came from CBN on Wednesday, and we've seen a lot in the papers. What is your take on what the CBN is really trying to do with this new policy of redesigning the notes?
So the Gen Zs are calling it Murphy money. I think, that Nigeria, in terms of monetary policy and in terms of controlling our inflation, it's been a bit difficult to get on top of. Inflation has been a global problem anyway, and you can see central banks around the world increasing their interest rates to try and get on top of it. Unfortunately, as you know from my book, because I know that you've read it, there's a big chapter on monetary policy transmission mechanisms and how, because we have such a large unbanked population in Nigeria, it's very, very difficult to control inflation through traditional monetary policy. So traditional monetary policy is raising interest rates to constrain the amount of spending in any society. Now, in America, we always make fun of people in the diaspora. We say their sofa is on credit, their house is on credit, their car is on credit, even the cosmetics in their bathroom are bought with a credit card. Now that might be bad in terms of personal debt, but it's very good in terms of monetary policy, because immediately you raise rates, it has a huge reverberation on everybody's lives.
Yes.
However, in Nigeria, where there's not that much credit anyway, not many people have access to credit and not many people are banked. When you raise rates, it doesn't have that huge reverberation on society. So they're looking for another way to try and mop up liquidity. And that's why they've decided to change the notes, the primary reason. There's secondary reasons around security, kidnappers storing notes, corrupt people storing notes. But I think the main
fears
thing
around money laundering and
all of these things. But I think the primary objective is to try and arrest inflation. And inflation is like an armed robber coming into all of our homes and stealing our savings.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a huge, and the primary objective of the central bank is price control. And everybody is complaining that, you know, people tell me that, you know, the people that they send to the market, like their household staff, are stealing from them, that how can things be that expensive? I'm like, you need to go to the market yourself. Like, things are super, super expensive. And I think that it's really, really worrisome for the central bank. But the timing, people question the timing. And I think I was the one that actually caused the timing. Because on Tuesday night...
You moved the markets, Dr.
Tuesday
Ola.
night, before it wasn't, you know, it was announced on Wednesday. So on Tuesday night, I tweeted that the price of Orbit chewing gum is now 750 naira. So I think that made the CBN panic.
So, but, you know, interesting. I mean, we understand the impact from a monetary policy perspective, but in terms of the timing of the introduction of this new redesign, given that elections are coming up next year, all the deadlines that have been set for people transitioning and bringing in their old notes, are you looking at maybe revisions to that timetable once the reality of this reform dawns on the authorities?
So I think the timing is interesting. I mean, a lot of countries that have done this before, like the UK, have given longer time frames. And I think it puts a lot of pressure on the banks. So I think that perhaps, especially in rural areas where there may not be bank branches, and even when the UK did this exercise, they were accusing the banks. So I think that the timeline is ambitious. And particularly in a country like Nigeria, they might need to involve like the post offices, perhaps, maybe agent banking outlets.
Yes.
But I think it's quite ambitious. I don't know whether there'll be a U-turn, to be honest. But I think, you know, the primary goal of the CBN is to arrest inflation. And inflation is a big problem. And obviously, continually raising rates makes the economy contract, which we don't want to do. So I mean, everything in economics, I say economics is quite like medicine. When a patient comes to you, you try something, give the person some drugs. If it doesn't work, you bring the person back the next week and try something else. And I think that, you know, economic policy, you never know the effects that it's going to have in a particular country. We've looked at the way it worked in India, we've looked at the way it's worked in the UK, and we don't know what the effect is going to be in Nigeria. But definitely we know that the economy is overheating.
Absolutely.
And the central bankers are desperately trying to cool the economy down. And hopefully, when they find the right method of doing that, it should create a more stable economy for all of us.
Thank you. Interesting insight. So let's move over to our dear Mr. Rishi Sunak of the UK. UK Prime Minister, third Prime Minister in 2 months. How is he going to calm UK markets? Do you think this is a stability that country needs from an economic perspective?
I think that they've finally probably hit on sort of the right kind of person. He's a steady hand. He has economic experience in the financial and economic markets. And I think that he's done a few reversals of some of the policies that were quite controversial. So the tax policy, for instance, has reversed that. And then the charges for GP visits is also reversed that as well. So I think that the markets trust him. And I think that that's important for the UK economy right now. I think he also needs to think about inflation, like everybody in the world needs to think about inflation quite carefully and how to control inflation, because the UK is also experiencing a cost of living crisis. But I think that he represents a kind of steady hand that understands the markets, who has friends in the markets. I think that he will bring some stability, hopefully, to the UK economy.
Yeah, great. I think we have time to touch on one more question. Just looking at the floods that have happened across Nigeria, starting with places like Kogi, Lokoja, and the issue of climate change, the issue of a dam. You know, what is going to be the real economic impact of this on the Nigerian economy?
So one of the most famous economists in the world, Friedman, said that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, meaning that monetary policy should always be the solution to inflation. But in Nigeria, I'm sure you agree with me that inflation is much more a structural issue. the fact that, you know, our logistics, our infrastructure, being able to transport goods across the country, floods, climate change, our agricultural efficiency actually has a huge effect on the pricing of our food. And until we fix those structural problems, we'll continue to have some form of inflation. There is a monetary component to it, but I also think there's a much bigger structural component to it. And I think the flooding has been, from a humanitarian perspective, awful. 600 people dead, 1 million people displaced. But I think for the overall economy, I mean, I think it was Olam saying that they've lost like their whole rice crop, for instance. Yeah. So that means much higher prices going into Christmas, and it means like a lot of, you know, real difficulty for a country that has some of the poorest people in the world. So that it's really, really worrying about the effect that this will have on prices and inflation. And
do you see any sort of long-term solutions to this flooding issue? I mean, aspects of climate change you know, there's some things that are beyond our control, but for those things that are within our control, what can the government really do?
I think that we're supposed to actually have a barrier dam. And I think I think the infrastructural things that we can do, but as you know, we're quite fiscally constrained in Nigeria right now in terms of our budget. We spend a lot of our budget, you know, repaying money that we've borrowed. But I think that there are infrastructural things. I'm not an engineer, but I think there are infrastructural things. Like there's been a lot of writing about the fact that we should have perhaps done a barrier dam. But obviously these things cost money and we have to prioritize. But now I think the government will be thinking quite carefully about the engineering and infrastructural solutions in the short term. But in the long term, we really need to tackle the issue of climate change as well.
Fantastic. Dr. Ola, great speaking to you and great seeing you. Thanks so much. Hopefully we can have you back soon.
Absolutely.
On the program.